Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Over this series we've been talking about justice. Justice between men and women, justice between our families, our communities and our societies. How we overcome conflict and effect positive change. And today I'd like to discuss one of the big questions that we're always asked from the social science perspective, which is why when Muslims have been historically so leading with ideas, leading in politics, really taking a role to change the world positively, why is it now that we find ourselves in very difficult circumstances so often, and particularly in the Western context? So we see an exchange of knowledge and ideas coming from the Muslim world for many centuries, for many millennia. Science, philosophy, ideas about how to organise our political systems, and similarly ideas going backwards and forwards in a very fluid and active and positive way, so that we have benefited humanity and the rest of humanity has benefited us. And yet today people talk about the clash of civilizations, they talk about the inherent backwardness of the Muslims and Islam. And we often look at minorities in Western countries. But what is exactly happening and what has happened? In the UK, for example, we have well over 1,000 years of engagement between Muslims and Western Europe, particularly through trade. For example, Somali and Yemeni merchants and North African merchants exchanging goods, but also bringing ideas, ways of life to these shores and back again. And indeed, long-standing Yemeni heritage and Somali heritage communities exist in the UK, which really illustrate that long history. And it's not something that's new, and it's not something that's always been so understood in such negative terms. Often we think of post-World War migration, and in particular the turmoil that the Second World War caused on a very large political scale, particularly the Second World War, when a lot of fighting went on in the Middle East, the geopolitical context changed, and the poverty that came to Western Europe after it had basically bankrupted itself through the war, calling upon its colonies and ex-colonies for help. So in a way, we already had that background and that dynamic of colonisation and the idea of subjects of an empire coming to the aid of the centre of empire, in the case of the UK, or in some cases France and or many other European countries. So we have this power dynamic, the idea that minorities, particularly Muslim minorities, but from all different backgrounds, were coming to help in manual labour, in factory work, to regenerate the economy of Western Europe in this context. So we have that power dynamic, the idea that people are going to work manually in large numbers, particularly young men, to reinvigorate the economy of these colonial and ex-colonial countries, where our citizens of different countries had already actually fought on the side of Western Europe against Nazism in many cases. But this economic need, where young men had been taken out of their environment into a very new one, young men in groups, young men going into inner cities to work in the factories, brought a particular dynamic to that social setting. So these were not people with necessarily huge economic resources, these were not people with huge educational resources, and they were coming into often a hostile environment. People were very happy for these minority men to work hard in the factories, but they were not so happy to share the streets, share the pubs, share the restaurants, share the wider social context. So the racism that people faced when they came to Western Europe was extremely explicit. So today we obviously still have racism, but not to the in the open sense that people faced then. I'm talking about the 1950s, up into the 1960s, and all the way up into the 80s, where we even had our first riots in response to police brutality and a general rejection, where signs that banned dogs from entering buildings were also banning non-white people. And this is in the UK. This is not just about the South African apartheid systems or the American Jim Crow situation, but also the unofficial barring of minority people that also included Irish people within the particularly English setting, but also broadly in Western Europe. And this history of difficulties in which minority people, including Muslims, were seen as a problem, as something to be worried about, particularly when people started to defend themselves, when they started to protest politically, increased. And the idea that somehow these people who had brought economic recovery to the nations were going to somehow disappear, go back, or just assimilate and be a silent, persecuted people without any stake in society was an assumption that was obviously wrong. Young men didn't want to be alone or just living with other young men. They wanted to bring families, they wanted to get married, they wanted to have children. And therefore we had second post-World War waves of migration where families came, women came, and communities began to grow. But again, still in that context of inner cities, in working class areas, in areas where, while factories were predominant and absolutely the backbone of Western economic production, and the empire had been built, and the money that we see now came from that manufacturing background and the idea of importing material from across the empire, cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and brought it to the UK where manufacturing of products happened. So we had big weaving mills here, we had sugar factories, this kind of real industrial economic powerhouse that was generated by these men in these inner cities, in the factories, who had begun to create communities. Suddenly, the decline of this manufacturing turned the situation even more difficult. So that the idea of these minorities who were already considered to be inferior by many people in that racist context were also then seen as not contributing to the economics, but somehow taking the jobs of local people. And that competition at the working class level was racialized, so that it wasn't about the working classes facing oppression from the middle and upper classes and their wealth. Rather, it was turned into something about white working class people against people of minority heritages, whether that was Pakistanis, Indians, people from the Caribbean, all of these people who had established communities, not only having been subjects of empire, but who have and remain citizens of this country. And therefore, as minorities in the West, it's very difficult to sometimes get out of that mentality that somehow we are visitors or that we must integrate into Western society. Rather, this is our society, this is our country, and we are citizens. But the dynamic of empire, I think, still remains, and it comes from the government, who talks about minorities, and it talks, many of our governments, in fact, who talk about minorities as if they are not part of the fabric of society. So this is one of the big background contexts that sets the scene for some of the struggles and difficulties that Muslims and other groups have within Western Europe in particular. But it also indicates the kind of power dynamics that we have across the world, where minorities are seen as a problem, as something to be feared, as something to be reviled. and not necessarily, in the Western context, we have, of course, Muslim minorities, we have people from the global south. In our countries across the Middle East, in South Asia, all over the world, we can see minorities from different backgrounds, whether it's Christian minorities, whether it's minorities of different ethnic background, of various heritages, who are often cast as less worthy of citizenship, as inherently problematic, as causing trouble, as bringing crime or stealing jobs. And it's the same kind of discourse that we see. Nazi Germany was built on the idea that we could, that the Nazis could blame people, could blame Jews for the problems of Germany, that the Jews were stealing the money, that the Jews were hurting children. Crazy ideas, crazy discourses, which were used to unite people and reject a minority. And although Nazi Germany is an extreme example, we can still see that same narrative, that same political idea that if we blame people that either can't protect themselves or don't have the numbers to protect themselves, then we can cause political power around that idea, and that we can create a unity and a strength in a nation that is not otherwise there. Of course, it could be there if we went about much more inclusive ways of being, but that's the context and the background. So what have been the repercussions of this dynamic, of the racism, of the community tensions, of the idea of Western states considering minorities to be a problem? Well, early on, the economic impact was created, that people were kept in areas around the inner city and in areas near factories that were always areas that were poverty-stricken. So the housing of minorities was often absolutely embedded in areas that were very difficult to get out of and very difficult to build a more economically empowered life, to get rich or to get more wealthy. Health issues always were and still remain, if we look at the statistics, a problem, whether it's access to health and understanding the health system, but also hand in hand with poverty or relative poverty. We see the health, particularly of women and of older people, degenerating much more quickly than the wider population. Even maternal health after childbirth, much lower amongst many minorities than the broader population. Education, this is again an issue that comes up generally within minorities, but also for Muslims. The statistics in the UK, and we can find this more broadly in many places in Europe and also the US, where there are minorities who are in poverty, or people in poverty full stop, because this is also happening to the white working class. We have lower educational achievements, particularly amongst boys and young men. So the path of those individuals, the path of those communities, are restricted by the lack of educational achievement. And by achievement, I don't mean necessarily knowledge about the world, but the ability to understand the education system, pass exams and move into the higher education, which enables people to then go on and get more jobs. And that's particularly pertinent in the situation that we all find ourselves in today, where austerity and the global economic crisis has impacted even more, and that people are struggling not just to have nice cars or nice houses, but to actually feed themselves. And that's happening in our rich Western nations. So please join me after the break to discuss this further. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, I was talking about some of the reasons why minorities generally get into situations or are forced into situations within all our countries that make them marginal, more vulnerable to lower educational levels and poverty, and how the broader political context often shapes the experience of minorities and creates this situation where it's very difficult to get out of, and how the global economic crisis has impacted even more and created even more extreme circumstances for many people. So not only are people having to rely on charity for food, and this is in our extremely wealthy nations in the West and across the world, but also for housing, homelessness, and homeless families or families who are vulnerable to homelessness across the board has increased dramatically. So the situation has become extreme for many people. And particularly for our youth and young men whose educational achievements have been continuously unexpectedly low. If we have a look at the populations, why? Not only is it about the expectations of our families on young people who have high expectations, who want achievement, but it's also the disadvantage more broadly. So the assumption by wider society that young men will not achieve, that young men should have other interests. It also impacts on their lives and on their ultimate ability to get ahead in life. And one of the very tragic consequences of all this social context and social background is the absolute disproportionate representation of our young men in particular within prisons. So we see young Muslim men and other minorities represented sometimes 4 or 5 times more than in the broader population within prisons. And again, is that because our youth are more criminally inclined, or is it because of the very complex and intersecting issues that they face? Now, although we can't necessarily immediately change the situation that we're living in, although of course it's important that we are actively working with and for change at a political level, but also at a social level, raising awareness that we've spoken about in other programs and making that change. There are other issues that we see happening within our communities linked to forms of criminality, which then are perpetuated. So the wider context, for example, of gang culture and the idea that it's cool and that young men should be macho and masculine and are actually often let out in ways that our young women aren't, that we are much more careful and in some cases controlling of our young women. But when it comes to young men, we allow them much more space to get around, but also turn a blind eye to some of their behaviour. We see the degeneration of young people into drug dealing, which is rife amongst many Muslim communities, particularly in Western European cities. We see sexual violence, gang violence, trafficking of young women in particular, and a whole range of quite shocking and serious activities that are not only damaging to those individuals, but damaging the fabric of our communities and our societies more widely. And for young people in particular, this range of challenges and the ease of which one can descend into these difficult circumstances and forms of criminality is also exacerbated again by the hostility that they often face. And I think it's difficult sometimes for older people, for adults, to understand the sort of general tension all the way from school upwards that young people can face, particularly around their faith. For, I guess, most of us who remember the pre-9/11 world, where things just were not as politicised. There were always moments where the idea of Muslims being problematic came up, but the fact that we now have this generation who have been born and brought up in a situation where their faith is vilified, where Muslims are seen as so dangerous, so problematic, and they are bullied around this issue, insulting names, physical violence, girls with their taunted about their headscarves, has created a situation where young people feel under attack. But not only are they victims of this kind of racism and a rejection, we see a reactionary situation where young people are then building up an identity around being Muslim that is hostile in itself. Thinking, for example, that there are no good non-Muslims, that there are this idea of the dirty kuffar is a very, it's perhaps not common across the board, but where it is strong. And young people having this idea that they are identifying in opposition to other people, not confident within themselves, but creating this barrier and creating a tension. So we have, again, extremists within our own communities who are fanning the flames and who are creating groups of youths who feel that it is perfectly reasonable to talk about how they should dominate people who aren't Muslim, or who should attack, or that it's permissible to rob someone who isn't Muslim, who it's permissible to deal drugs to who isn't Muslim. And so there we have this polarisation. We have far-right groups, Nazi groups, talking about how Muslims are evil, oppress women, are sexually deviant, and all of the other racist, wrong stereotypes. But then we have this reactionary situation, particularly amongst our youth, where the idea of being Muslim isn't about necessarily about spirituality or loving the deen or worshipping Allah. It is rather creating an identity that is strong and macho and in opposition and resisting the kind of racism and hostility that they find. So this overwhelmingly negative picture that I've been talking about, which of course doesn't correspond to all of our situations, and in fact if we have a look at minority achievements, including and particularly Muslim minority achievements in the UK and more broadly, we see again disproportionately high numbers of people engaged with the state, whether it's as politicians, in community organisations, in the arts, in law, all of the sectors, the public sector, local government, and of course business. We see very high levels of successful business people within Muslim communities who bring not only wealth to their own families and communities, but more broadly create employment. So we have these amazing success stories. But as well as these amazing success stories and disproportionate number of success stories, especially when we take into consideration the challenges that people face, we also have this disproportionate number of people who are in difficult situations, and a youth, a small but considerable number of youth who are facing these extreme problems, including levels of criminality. So the question therefore is, what can be done about this? How can we turn around all the difficult situations into those success stories? How can we challenge the issue of ill health, of poverty, of low educational achievement, of criminality, and turn that around? Well, if we look at kind of sociological theories that are often utilised by governments, we see a whole range of ideas, many of which have been proven to not only not work, but to create more problems. Our difficulty is that governments don't always recognise this or acknowledge it, because some of these ideas are ultimately ideological. So the first one is assimilation. And this was something from the UK context that happened quite early on, and almost without thought. It was the assumption, it was the normative idea that minorities in a majority context, despite looking different or believing different things or having different cultures, would eventually soak up the environment around them and become, in the words of some of the colonial administrators, white men with brown skin. And that's the kind of phrase that was used, and the mentality is often still there, that they would, all minorities would shed their own interests and cultures and religions and essentially become the normative European or American citizen. Slightly different from the Americans, because the Americans have had this melting pot. And we see France absolutely operating on this idea where religious symbols are considered to be anti-state, where a woman covering her face is not only seen as problematic from a misguided human rights perspective, but where minorities are expected to somehow become French in a way that is actually about a particularly Christian, white, bourgeois French heritage. So the identification of a nation is so narrow that everyone else is expected to fit into it and be quiet about it. So of course this hasn't worked, it doesn't work, it alienates people, and it's created these divisions between those who have and those who have not. What we do see, however, is, and we can see this within the, coming from our Islamic framework and the framework that crosses boundaries, where people can come together and look beyond those kind of boundaries. So we have, academics have called this different words. They've talked about community cohesion, where we bond and bridge differences more easily. We've talked about multiculturalism, where communities in their differences still manage to find common goals and work together. So it's not about minorities and majorities, it's about all the different people that we have coming together for common goals. And what's beautiful about these ideas is that we can be part of it, and that we can actually promote these ideas and promote these positive social relations by engaging. So doing the things that I've discussed before and that many of you are already active in, community organising, not only within our own particular localities or groups, but doing interfaith work, doing inter-community and intercultural work. So crossing the bridges and actually creating dialogue so that on a local level, it isn't about Muslims against Christians, but Muslims and Christians working together for a common goal, for improving our schools, for improving the economic viability of a local area. Similarly, within our Muslim communities, we have these kind of ethnic tensions. So Somali groups being rejected by Pakistani groups, or and we can see similar situations all over the world. But instead of seeing those intra-ethnic tensions, again, can we come forward, can we unite? And particularly as Muslims, that kind of tension is absolutely abhorrent within the Islamic framework. So how do we work across that? How do we, suck it up and move forward and get over the kind of tensions that we might have, the ill feeling we might have, and support each other, often in the face of very difficult circumstances. So I hope this was helpful and that you'll join me next time. Assalamu alaikum.